Good morning, Claire.
Hi there. I just sent you a quick message, but it was in the other LD4 Slack, just about one of our polls. I wanted to double check a functionality before I say something out loud.
Okay. I did turn on the live stream, so I will check your message right now. I'll be right back.
Okay.
And Michelle or Elizabeth, I guess that you guys can now put me out of panelists. I'm happy to stay here if you want to, but it's up to you guys.
Welcome, everybody, to the LD4 Steering Group poll. I'm Michelle Futornick, representing the program committee, and I'm happy to be facilitating this session. And behind the scenes, joining me is Xiaoli Li, conference co-chair, and she'll be monitoring the chat and the QA. So by now, you know what the LD4 conference is all about, but you may still be wondering what the LD4 community is all about. In today's panel, you're going to get to meet some of the LD4 Community Steering Group members, learn why they think community is valuable, and most importantly, you'll have a chance to ask questions and to share your input. So I'm going to, whoops, sorry, I'm on the last slide by accident instead of the first slide. Okay. I'm going to let the steering group members introduce themselves as we go. So first up is Claire DeMarco.
Everyone, thanks so much for having me here. My name is Claire DeMarco. I'm the interim head of information and technical services and associate director of UX and strategy at Harvard Library. And my dual titles might give you a bit of a window into why I'm part of the LD4 community, but we all know that there's no one title or role at an institution that makes you part of LD4. So I would say that my participation in LD4 began in very unofficial or maybe grant adjacent spaces. I was thinking about where and how we could expose external data sources in our primary discovery layers at Harvard. And I started thinking and asking questions of my very smart, much smarter than me colleagues. And they trusted me enough to bring me in and ask those questions again to their colleagues at other institutions. But I worried for more than a year, and maybe sometimes I still worry, that I don't really get linked data. But what I do get, and I'm confident in, is my understanding of connection. And I was so inspired by our opening keynote from Jessica Meyerson, her framing of boundaries, the alignment between data, community, and self. That really spoke to me about the need to build inclusive and permeable, but meaningful boundaries around this community. based around our individual and collective vision of purpose. So as we figure that out together, the steering committee wants to make sure that we draw our own boundary in a way that brings us all together. And as we just saw in the closing plenary, when we asked about how experienced people say they are with linked data, about 2/3 of us believe ourselves to be knowledgeable but learning. And thanks to Zoe Dobbs for pointing out that we are always learning. So in that spirit, I want to welcome you all today with a bold statement about who is part of the LD4 community. And the answer is all of us and so many more. So if you've ever attended the conference here, check box 1, or been part of a grant, or participated in an affinity group call or the LD4 Slack, you're part of this community. And there are so many other ways. We have a little poll to show how people have come to our community, just reminding us that there's no one path, no one way to be properly aligned or participating in the right way with linked data. So it's so great to see your answers come in, and feel free to pop in the chat other ways that you came to this community or that you regularly participate, so we can really get a collective sense of the shape of this community, which is driven by all of us. So I believe now I'll be handing things off to one of my mentors in this community, someone who first made me feel welcome, Tom Kramer, who is going to give us a snapshot of where the community is today.
Hey, Claire and all, I just found out that Tom is unable to join us at the last minute. So I am going to move on to Elizabeth Russey Roke. And if Tom is able to join, we'll come back to him.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me as part of this panel. Just to give a brief introduction to myself, I am the Discovery and Metadata Archivist at Emory University in the Stuart A. Rose Library, that's Special Collections. So I'm an archivist by training. I'll just say that if I were to think back on my career of where I started, I never thought I would be in a community like this. I actually thought I was going to be a reference archivist and have nothing to do with metadata. But it has become my thing. And those of you who know me know I can just talk on and on about metadata all the time. And I want to focus in my few minutes about LD4 to talk about learning and how LD4 promotes learning, especially among smaller institutions and organizations where I heard in the opening plenary, people said, I'm the only one doing linked data at my university. And LD4 being a place that we can find others who are doing the same work that we're doing. And I think it's really tempting sometimes for those of us just starting out to just let bigger guys like Library of Congress and the Stanfords of the world to just figure it all out for us. And then we'll buy that product when it eventually comes out. But I think that would be a missed opportunity. And I kind of want to tell a story of my very first experience with linked data, because I think it illustrates really how we as a community need to function to invite others into this space. So many years ago, the Premise editorial board put out a call to create a new RDF ontology for Premise 3. And I had worked with that standard as a digital archivist. I had been doing metadata. And I wanted a chance to advocate for data modeling that I thought was missing from what I currently saw in the documentation for disk images and born digital material. But I was new to linked data and really, really lost in the definitions of classes, properties, domains, ranges. I couldn't keep it all straight. But I did have experience in the preservation of born digital material and the metadata that we needed and wanted. I was just missing that linked data piece. So I was feeling a bit out of my league, but brave. And I thought I had something to contribute. So I joined that Premise 3 ontology group. I spent a lot of time reading definitions and W3C documents I didn't understand. But the point I want to make is the premise group I was in, many of whom actually have been in LD4 and are on this call, that you would recognize the names if you saw them. But they were supportive and patient of me having space to learn. I was able to ask questions, make mistakes without fear, and all the contributions of the group were valued equally. So that by the end of the project, I was by no means an expert, but I had begun to feel comfortable in linked data enough to ask questions I had been afraid to ask, develop modeling, feel that I had contributed to the project, and be interested enough in linked data to try it again in another space. And I moved on to schema is the next thing that I worked with a new group. And this is the sort of culture and environment that I've found in LD4. And I hope all of you are finding in LD4 as well, a space where everyone can contribute, where we can learn from each other, build skill sets, value the diversity among us and the different pieces of knowledge rather than conformity, and recognize that the vision of a global linked data ecosystem for libraries relies on creating these sort of iterative attempts that provide useful paths for everyone to participate. And just to give one call out, and this is a group I've been involved in, and I know that many other groups support this kind of collaboration, but this is one I've been in. I just want to give a call out to Hillary and the Wikidata Affinity group. I went to their meeting yesterday, and it's this really welcoming space where each meeting has an opportunity for learning, sharing their experience that they've had on their own with others, and encouraging each other. Spending a lot of time and being patient and making nobody feel lost, intimidated, being able to ask those hard questions. I've been inspired by all the sessions I've been to this week. And I'm excited to try some of the things that I've learned. So in that spirit, I just want to take a couple minutes to look at the mission and vision of LD4. Michelle, if you can put that, yeah, there it is. The long-term vision is simple, but it's immense. It's quite a task that we've laid out for ourselves to enrich the world with library data and enrich our own data with the world. In other words, break down those silos that currently exist between libraries and the wider world. The mission statement expands on it and expresses values, establishing an open, diverse, sustainable, and library and archives-led community. Together, we explore, learn, and collaborate to raise awareness and know-how, encourage adoption, and foster an ecosystem of interoperable standards, tools, and services. There's a lot to unpack in there. You know, open data, interoperability, diversity, sustainability, exploration, collaboration, ecosystem, lots of these sorts of words, just to name a few. But instead of trying to unpack this and getting into all this, I'm going to suggest that we do something a little more concrete and think about the vision and mission with a practical lens. Michelle, if you can go to the next slide for me. Yeah, so this week on the conference Slack, on the LD4 conference Slack, someone was talking about a project that needed to be done and asked, is LD4 a good place for that? It's a provocative question. And as Jessica Meyerson reminded us in her talk on Tuesday about community, something that Claire mentioned as well, a community can't be everything to everyone. It has to know what its boundaries are to be effective. So if you can go to the next slide. What I'd like to do next is to ask you, the LD4 community, to give us your opinions. Let's spend a couple minutes thinking about what we think we are. So if I can get people to respond to the question and propose the end to that sentence. So instead of it being a question, LD4 is a good place for what? What do you find LD4 a good place for? And I'll just pause there and see some of the thoughts. Asking questions, that is definitely true for me. Yes, learning, community, and engagement, sharing and learning. Yes. Yeah, and that's what I found, as I said earlier, is collaboration, promoting the benefits of linked data, also a place for us to work together and start to build those standards to support linked data implementation, a place to make connections, a place to find someone else who's doing something you want to do, and slowly, iteratively build that infrastructure so that we can move forward together, not just piecemeal, something that I think is sometimes hard to do and something that I hope that LD4 will be able to promote in the world of linked data. Awesome. And by the way, we are recording all of these, so we will be using these and releasing this information. So thank you all. And I'm going to turn it over to Sherine to talk about our next section. Sherine?
Hello. Hello to everyone. My name is Sherine Eid. Can you hear me?
Yes, Sherine,
Okay.
you sound great.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Sherine Eid. I'm a head of International Library Projects Unit at Bibliotheca Alexandrina in Egypt. My main responsibilities include developing and maintaining Arabic metadata standards according to international standards and guidelines. My main research interest is implementing linked data projects and services in the Arab region. I have published many publications in this area. Well, libraries are keen to exchange ideas. That this fits the character of linked data technology, which demands acting and thinking globally, even when implementing and doing things at a local scale. My goal for joining the LD4 Steering Committee and being part of the LD4 community is applying semantic web technologies in the library, archive, and museum community in the Arab region, and integrating semantic web technologies with existing systems. As for applying linked data technology in the Arab region, there have been a few initiatives to pivot the library metadata ecosystem to the realm of linked data, such as the Lebanese National Library and Bibliotheca Alexandrina are participating in the Virtual International Authority Files, the VIAF project, by submitting their authority records. Also, the Bibliotheca Alexandrina has collaborated with the Library of Congress in the BibFrame implementation phase to test the BibFrame vocabulary, editor, and data model by converting Bibliotheca Alexandrina Arabic Mark 21 records into BibFrame and establishing new Arabic BibFrame records. Also in December 2017, the UNESCO, which stands for the Arab League Educational, Cultural, and Scientific Organization, signed a memorandum of understanding with Birzeit University, in which Birzeit University digitized the lexicons issued by UNESCO and published them in a specialized search engine. This is in addition to using the Arabic ontology developed by the university in linking the Arabic lexicons. In addition, the linked data technology has been utilized in the technology enhanced learning field to enable the reuse and interoperation of open educational resources, OER data. URIs are used to name the OER data. The UNESCO OER project launched in October 2017 allows teachers and students from Arab countries to create, share, search, and retrieve suitable OERs. As you can see, Bibliotheca Alexandrina and other leading libraries in the Arab region have been the leading forces in implementing linked data projects and services in libraries, while still most small libraries in the Arab region are watching and waiting rather than participating. There is a lack of prototype that will demonstrate the benefits of library data as linked data, and many librarians still cannot envision how the future semantic catalog looks and works. The magnitude of data involved, about 40 years of cataloged data, is not an easy task to be transformed into linked data. Library vocabularies and ontologies are complex and take a long time to complete. But still, linked data is the right future for libraries. Linked data in libraries will make sense, in my opinion, if when linked data practices are firmly established, when BibFrame has been solidified, when library services platforms and the integrated library systems can comply and can meet user searches, in library LD data stores. Also, when ongoing financial support is provided. I would like to take this opportunity to ask for the funding resources to be available throughout the US and internationally that could provide mandatory support for libraries. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sherine, for that introduction. And as Claire said earlier, we're all part of this community just by being here and by interacting in those other ways that were mentioned. And throughout the conference, there's been a theme of all the different ways that linked data touches people, that it's part of a larger ecosystem and cycle of data creation and care and use. So we want to ask now, who is missing right now in our interactions with data and in our LD4 burgeoning community? So we're going to go to another poll where you can share your thoughts about who is missing from the LD4 community. So vendors, library school students, UX, end users is definitely a big category that we can think about how to get involved. And data consumers, same. Public libraries. And we were thrilled to have Paul Bethke on our program committee this year from the Iowa City Public Library, and really bringing that representation into the planning. A lot of plus ones for the public libraries. People who are described by linked data and represented in the data. This is great. Thank you, everybody. Our next question is related to this. It's about what are the barriers to participation? So to allow these missing groups and people and representatives to come in. Money, yes. Lack of tools and standards, our own opinions of our capabilities. Resources. This is great. While these are coming in, would any of the panelists like to comment on how you see the LD4 community being able to overcome some of these barriers?
Yeah, sure, Michelle. I'm really interested from my own personal perspective to hear more about how people believe that we can and should engage end users in the community. In my own space, I oversee a user research lab, and we've had a lot of success conducting studies, and we've talked about that in the LD4 Discovery Group. But the idea that for many people, we don't necessarily want to have to explain the back end ways that data is presented to them when they interact with it. And so the goal of usability of making it seamless for them rather than forcing them to understand the process in order to successfully, articulate a search, for example. And that's something that goes way beyond linked data when we think about those of us from a reference background really wanting people to use Boolean searching, et cetera. So I'd be interested in the chat if people have ideas for ways to engage without putting a burden on end users to understand our systems in order to engage.
Yeah, and I'll just say, I think that's a really good point about users not needing to know how it works, just that it does. And I think that happens over and over in this. I mean, it's what happens when you start with a bunch of people who have pretty deep technical expertise. We want to get into the nitty gritty of, and here's how it works, and that's a really hard case to make to ULs. It's cool because look at how complicated it is. So I'm really, the thing that resonated with me is a lot of this administrative buy-in as well, of how do you explain something in a way that says, yeah, it's kind of the same on the front end. It's just better, and getting funding for that kind of thing. And I think that's absolutely true about colleagues as well. How do we present this in a way that shows the benefit that isn't dependent upon people understanding the technology? Yeah, and I agree with in the chat what Jeanette says. Administrators need to see a demonstration of how the interfaces can be improved. And this actually came up in one of the sessions I attended the other day, in talking about how there's really a dearth of products that really show the power. It's a lot of editing interfaces, and we need more discovery layers to be able to show that. And that's a helpful comment from Huda. When I think user involvement, I mean more around including them around interface design and decisions where the system uses linked data. So it's not about the back end, but rather exploring what helps users. Yeah, and from Christine, more emphasis on user interfaces and UX. The only way I've successfully engaged in linked data with non-librarians, non-academics has been through Wikidata editathons.
And Alex Provo adds, I think some users would benefit from understanding the underlying data structures. It can help with critical engagement. So definitely a balance to be struck here.
I also like that idea because one of the other groups that we talked about being missing were the people that the data is about whom we have data, and that engaging them, as Christina's saying, in here is where the data lives and how you can control it, how you can participate in it. Those seem to me to be two user engagement streams. One is, how can I use what's presented to me to find what I'm looking for, even if that is no longer simply a library, but a controlled library catalog controlled by one entity, versus how can I contribute, how can I engage in the creation of the data that is then discoverable. So those two fronts, I know personally that Christine has had a lot of success on that editing side, and that Huda is over here on the kind of discovery side. And I think what is really interesting is, are those two separate user communities that we need to continue to engage with and have directed engagement with, or are they the same and part of a broader ecosystem?
Thanks for all the ideas that people are putting in. If you want to share your idea with everyone, please remember to chat to all panelists and attendees, and then all your fellow participants will see it. Sherine, you talked about trying to introduce the concept of linked data and show, like we've been talking about, show its value. Would you like to add anything else about what the barriers are to bringing people along to linked data adoption from what you've seen? Sherine, go ahead and.
Okay. Well, I have mentioned some barriers for joining the community, the linked data community, but I think there is a general lack of awareness of the basic concepts of linked data among library and information professionals. Well, that was clear in the poll that was made a while ago, that there are around 25 or 26% that they are still beginners in the linked data. I think one of the biggest challenges that we are going to face, that there is a lack of best practices with respect to linked data. Linked data technology for many libraries are still new and unproven in libraries. And I think the technology is complex to implement in some libraries. But there is no one size fits all tool. That there are a great varieties of tools that are used, commercial, open sources, and specialized alongside locally developed routines. If you want to join the community, you can know all of these varieties of tools. Yani libraries are keen to exchange ideas. So we are here to exchange and learn from each other. That's it.
Yeah, I think that's a really essential point, and we're seeing it a little bit from the community here on the slide. This flip side of open being good is also being comfortable with not controlling our data. And I think the thing to bring out here that Sherine is also sort of saying is this sort of flexibility, where at this point where we are with linked data, anything is possible. And there's a lot of experimenting going on, but also like the ethos of linked data. And the thing that I find really exciting and terrifying all at the same time is whatever works for you goes. And that can be really hard for librarians and metadata people who are used to following standards and saying, well, what's rule 2.6.8.1, and being able to follow those content standards, to being comfortable in a transmission standard or a data standard that is so open and flexible that you can just mint your own property if you really want to. The other thing that I want to mention here that I think may also be a barrier that's sort of been alluded to before in the conversation, but so much of this work that we do in technical services, and we've already talked about it being hidden, but there's also a high maintenance cost. And I think some of these things tend to be forgotten as we're building new things and exciting things, is that there's a lot of, if we're doing our jobs right, users won't notice any of it. In some ways, their searching will just be better. But the background overhead, even for administrators and librarians, it's not visible. The maintenance isn't visible. The resources it requires to put it together isn't visible. And it's hard to make that visible because if we're doing it right, it's not visible. And I think that's one of the things has been talked about here with advocacy, that the LD4 community really should start thinking about how to dig into is how we advocate for this space, how we make the case in a way that also acknowledges the work and labor that has to go into creating these better systems and structures.
Thank you for all the ideas and responses that you've been putting into chat and the poll. And I want to open it up for anyone to ask questions of our panelists. You can put it in the chat, you can raise your hand, and I can unmute you if you'd like to speak your question. Or you can put it in the Q&A box. I'm reading some of the chat. Stephen Hearn says, does the freedom of linked data lead to problems with sharing metadata using inconsistent properties and values? So back to that tension that you were talking about, Elizabeth, between you can do anything, but then does that lead to other problems with being able to share the data in the way you want to? While you're thinking of your questions for the panelists, I have a question I wanted to ask you. The American Library Association recently did a panel on the semantic web 20 years later, looking at have we achieved what was promised from the semantic web? And the participants didn't think we had achieved the promise yet. And they thought the main obstacle was lack of tools and systems. And I want to ask you if you think that this is a tool and system problem, or is it a community problem, or how do those things interact with each other? Go ahead, Claire.
That's really interesting. I will say my knee-jerk reaction is to say I would respectfully disagree, but because of all the reasons that we've all articulated, the imposter monster in me doesn't want to doubt that expertise and their assessment. One thing I would say is that tools and systems are only valuable if we can demonstrate adoption and value. And so while the underlying cause for not achieving our goals might be a failure of systems and tools, the reason for that failure is in part connected to how we articulate the value. And that leads to the things that folks have been talking about: financial resources, kind of prioritization by library administrators. And I think the fact that this community is now feeling, to me, more open and a place for learning and a place for sharing, rather than, as Elizabeth articulated earlier, kind of a place where things are happening over there and we'll wait and take advantage of what happens over there. And so perhaps, although the 20 years may have felt like a long tail, we're just now getting that organic growth and that organic interest and the broader understanding of value that will lead to more investment in systems and tools.
I think I'm going to take a middle ground halfway in between what Claire said and what the panel said. Is I do think that tooling is certainly important. As someone who comes from an institution that is well resourced, but less interested in linked data right now due to other priorities, it's hard to do linked data just on paper. And if you don't have the technology infrastructure, it's really hard to get started. And I think that's actually been shown in this conference and others by the amount of sessions on Wikidata. Over 50% of the sessions here this year had something to do with Wikidata. And I think that's because it gave us a platform, a place that people can start playing and see results from playing. They can run Sparkle queries, they can add to the graph. And so I do think that there's a need for tooling. And as we saw the missing people in the community, I also agree that I wish vendors were a lot more involved here. It makes me a little nervous because I always worry about my priorities being heard in those communities. But I do think that there's a gap in tooling, and I am happy to see Library of Congress releasing its editor for BibFrame. in open source on GitHub so others can download it and play with it. I am happy to see so much work being done around Wikidata and ways that even small institutions or single shops can actually make an impact in the data graph. So I think tooling is always a problem, but it's, as Claire said, it's not really the core problem. It's a symptom of the problem more than anything else. And not really the issue, but one of the things that has to be tackled along the way.
Sherine, did you want to add anything about community versus tools or the interaction between them?
No, I totally agree with the panelists that it's not the core problem. The tools are not the core problem. I think that the fund is the main problem. Also that many small libraries, they don't understand the linked data principles and practices. I think these are the main problems with linked data, not the tools itself.
Thank you. So I want to take the questions now that are there in the Q&A. First is, what are the steering committee's priorities for the next year?
I'll take the first crack at that. I think, first of all, hopefully folks who have been, we talked about ways to engage, some of the folks who have been on the mailing lists and in Slack know that Elizabeth and Sherine and I, along with Nancy Falgren, are new members to the steering group. And I think one of the goals is to take some time to see what the influx of these new members means to the shape and the priorities for the group itself, right? To just kind of marinate in what it means to be trying to bring diversity of institution, gender, background, perspectives, kind of into this conversation at the steering group level. And then the other thing is to really articulate and socialize, as we saw again in the opening plenary, the idea of the vision and missions, those documents. We all had our first pass at those, but I like to consider that while those do set some boundaries for our community today, they are living documents. And so I think we should continue, by virtue of the work that's happening in our affinity groups and in our different spaces, to test those boundaries and see if they remain accurate, see where there might be problems or a need to stretch or change. So I think that will, it might feel like an insular priority, but I think it will actually help in the long run in establishing the community and broader goals.
Thanks for that, Claire. There is a popular question in the Q&A. Will the LD4 conference remain online next year or have an online component? And Mary says, I think this has really opened up opportunities for attending and participation, although I understand those who might miss in-person networking. So if you could talk about plans for next year's conference.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really interesting question as one of the outgoing chairs of this year's conference. I will say that we have recognized how wonderful it is that it's free and open, everybody can participate. We've seen lots of people coming in that I think probably wouldn't have been able to attend a conference like this in person. And that's something I personally don't want to lose as we go forward. The post-conference survey, I will also say, ask this question of all of you, and I hope you all take the time to respond, because steering is really interested in hearing what people have to say on this. Is this a conference that really needs to be a virtual conference, even though we do lose some of those opportunities, or if there is an in-person component, what does that look like? Is this a community that wants a traditional, we all sit in the hall and listen to presentations, or is there some alternative way that we can meet together? I think the door is wide open. I don't think I would say we are definitely going to do this or definitely do this. And yes, as David says in the chat, is there an option for both, a hybrid or two separate conferences? I think absolutely. I think we're looking for ideas. I'm excited about what we can do. We're a bunch of really savvy people and comfortable, some of us, with technology, or at least learning. So I'm really hopeful for the future and what this conference brings. But please do take time to respond to the post-conference survey, because we will be looking to that as a primary way to make that decision.
And if I can just jump in quickly, because it might, I want to take the opportunity with Elizabeth serving in both places to just compliment the entire conference planning group on behalf of the steering group. So letting you be in both spaces, Elizabeth, but also personally, I have not seen such an elegant use of the tooling that allows for virtual participation and the kind of longevity of not having to be at things live to participate. Many of our virtual conferences and other spaces have over-architected solutions, and you kind of get lost in the tech. This, I thought, was a perfect balance, and I felt very included, and I know other people felt the same way. So thank you.
That's great.
And I will say that on behalf of the entire program committee, who all worked incredibly hard on this conference. It was not an easy task to keep all the balls in the air. And our program committee has just been amazing.
I second that. Iman adds in the chat that the virtual format allows more international participation for sure. And we've really seen that. Sherine, do you want to add anything from about your hopes for next year's conference and how you'd like to see that evolve?
I hope next year that there will be other nationalities, from Asia, from Europe, from France, from England, from the MENA region. That's my hope, to widespread the LD community technology to the whole world, not only specific regions. That is my only hope for the next year.
That's excellent vision to work towards.
Yeah, and if I can add something to that, that's something that I personally have noticed this year and am interested in is, this has been a very English-centric conference. And one of the things I'm particularly interested in thinking through with members of the community is how we diversify that. I mean, one of the promises of linked data, right, is that we don't all have to be in English anymore, and how we can work that element into our conferences intentionally, and have a space for non-English speakers, and not make it so American-centric, and how we can continue to explore that.
Okay, another question is about other communities. Are there other communities that LD4 is looking to connect and collaborate with, such as AI for LAM or LOD-LAM or IFLA's linked data group, any number of those? So are there other communities you're reaching out to, and what kind of collaborations do you imagine with other communities?
I think that was one element in growing the steering group that we hoped to expand, was just kind of the natural overlap with other communities. And I think, Elizabeth's representation of the archives community is a great one. I know that there's been quite a bit in the AI space, and both Tom and I had participated, and I'm sure others, but I think what would be best is to hear the articulation, again, that question of who's missing and where are the connection points. We are but 8 now people, and our individual ecosystems can overlap in really interesting ways. But I would say one of the goals of establishing the boundaries of this community is to say who's missing, what are the other connection points that aren't necessarily organically represented just by individuals' participation. So I would invite those suggestions from the community to us as well.
Sherine, were you going to say something about that?
I think maybe if next conference in the next year, if we can have entrepreneurs and translators in translation to French or in Arabic, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you. Definitely a way to connect to more communities.
And I like what Alexandra has said in the chat that, you know, the College Art Association has affiliate panels at their conference. Maybe that kind of thing might work. I think that's a good idea to, again, we're not a governing body. LD4 is looser than that. And I think that's true actually of most of the linked data communities that have been mentioned here. It's people who are interested in a thing and get together to talk about that thing and build things. And I like the freedom and flexibility of those communities, but it does make it hard to make sure that one hand knows what the other hand is doing. So I think we do need to be intentional and seek out those and deliberately invite to our own conferences and propose at other conferences to make sure that that cross-pollination is happening and that we're not just librarians and archivists speaking in an echo chamber to ourselves. And that we are sure to welcome in some of the end users. I mean, that would be an interesting thing to do for a new affinity group, or even looking at a specific project or conference presentation, you know, that's really focused on people consuming our data and how they consume that. So I think there's lots of opportunities there.
And there's a question about whether you have any plans around training opportunities.
Yeah, that was something that when Sherine joined, I remember her articulating so clearly kind of that desire for a curriculum. And some folks in the steering group kind of, I think, were, again, to Elizabeth's point, we're not a governing body. We aren't an accrediting body. So the idea of what would training led by the LD4 community look like. But one of the reasons I like this question so much is we saw in the different polls that people come to this place to learn, right? What do we do here? We learn, we teach, we connect, and we are all learners. And I wonder if, you know, one of the pathways to kind of developing smaller communities of practice within the broader LD4 context is the use of affinity groups. I wonder if anyone who is seeking that kind of training opportunity would be interested in an affinity group that is dedicated towards what does learning in this space look like, and what are the opportunities, and really having that that inventory, that shared space for where and how people can learn in explicit ways without making it feel as though from the top down we're somehow endorsing a curriculum for linked data. But I would love to see that, and maybe that's a good outgrowth of this.
Yeah, and I think spaces for learning about linked data, because, I mean, yes, it's a 20-year-old plus technology, but I think it being so new, there aren't a lot out there. You know, it's lots of conference recordings and learning it, as I mentioned for myself, learning it on the fly and being brave enough to try it. But I do think there needs to be more formal curriculum in it. And I agree with Claire that may be something that we can start inching towards as a community, of how we not only to help our community members, but also I'm also thinking library schools, of how we help library schools have those resources. I saw in the chat someone mentioned that they use LD4 recordings to be able to do that from sessions. And I think that's excellent and something that we probably should be more proactive in helping the various universities really start to train up this next generation of librarians, archivists, and museum professionals. And I really like that idea from Stephen. I've always thought of LD4 as a space to onboard community members. I like that idea.
Yeah, and we saw a great presentation this week from Charlene and Joya at NYU about training their own group together, like coming up with a curriculum at their institution and working together in a study group, and that could easily be replicated without having to do a top-down formal thing. But maybe the community can support that kind of sharing of training that already works, that just can be expanded to more people with mentors. That would be great to see. We have one more question, which is, how should we think about data stability in an open community, especially for our users?
we should think about it. So here's where I get to say I looked at all the very, very smart people I see in the attendees list. These are heady questions that I think we absolutely need to engage with. Claire probably has a better answer than I do, but I would say that as a community, we certainly need to start thinking through these sorts of issues. But yes, Claire.
I have a provocative answer as usual, which is how potentially thinking about how data stability has contributed to some problematic elements in our data over time. And so data stability on its face always something we want to strive toward. Data flexibility, data accuracy can change. And so perhaps, again, if we're thinking about the user community as one user community as the folks who are engaged in editing, creating, enhancing in a shared space, that might actually contribute to destabilize data that could be more accurate over time. I don't know the answer to that question, but I think it's an exciting one.
Yeah, definitely something that the community can make space for us to explore. I want to ask what a lot of you might be wondering, which is how can people get more involved besides the conference, besides the affinity groups? What else can they do?
Well, this is where Tom's snapshot would have been super helpful. Definitely involvement in affinity groups. Getting on the Slack channel is a great place to start. Personally, I've found that to be a great way to get involved in the community. And I think on our last slide, we might have some other ways to engage. There we go. So, as I said, there's a lot of organic opportunities for getting involved that are ways to, again, create that culture of learning. If you can introduce your colleagues to things that you've learned from here, if you can push and talk about and socialize the idea of linked data at your institution, you're participating. If you can ask tough questions, if you can teach and learn new skills, those are all ways to contribute, as we said, that aren't about one path leading to I am part of the LD4 community, but all experiences in this space making our community richer.
Yeah, and I'll just add that this is not the only list, of course. There have been so many good ideas generated just in this hour today. I've been taking notes, and I will probably revisit this recording. It'll be one of the ones I revisit. Some of the collaborating with different organizations and some of these other ideas that have been generated today, I think could easily be added to this list. This to me feels like one of those 50 things you can do ... lists that I hope that we all continue to add and encourage others to participate with us.
Any final comments from our panelists?
Just thank you. And thank you for welcoming those of us who feel relatively new into this conversation.
Yeah, agreed with that. Thank you, everybody, for your engagement. That is one of the things I love most about this community is people's willingness to just start something, invite others to do it with them. And I hope to be able to continue to participate in all of the projects of LD4 and with all the wonderful people I've met. There's been a lot of conversations about virtual conferences versus in-person conferences. And I'll say I've really enjoyed the virtual space, but coming to the close of this, I really wish I could go out for a drink with 98%, with 100% of all of you. And that's one thing that I'm missing here because I love talking metadata. So thank you, everybody, for being so engaged.
Yeah, and thank you, Claire, Elizabeth, and Sherine. It's really
Thank
great.
you very much.
So great to see your leadership of the steering group, and it's really exciting to think about what might be coming. So stay around. Today, there's a lot more great sessions coming, including some affinity group meetings, and thank you for being here.